Hello and welcome to another episode of A Rough Sketch of History. We're going to resume our covering of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the second phase. And a little bit of a disclaimer as we get into this, actually two disclaimers. Of course, the standard one I like to give before any of these, that we are discussing a very catastrophic and terrible battle, so there will be discussions of the events that were present that some people might find unsettling or disturbing. I try to be respectful and not to be gratuitous about these descriptions, but I do feel that some of the more graphic aspects do need to be described to understand the nature of the events. With that said, the second disclaimer is that it's been several months since my last recording, so I'm a little out of practice and some different camera equipment now and some other things. Things got in the way, but I'm able to resume the project now, so I'm excited to finish this up. So with that said, let's review our sketch map. Again, make sure that's all centered for the camera. Okay. And okay, so let's just kind of review some of the points that we have before we go on, just so you know what we're talking about. Over here is our map. This is how the battlefield unfolded. We have this black line here represents roughly the starting point of the American advance. This over here, this green area, is the Argonne Forest. This is the Seine River. This is the Meuse River. Again, that's why it's the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, because it's taking place between the Argonne Forest and the Meuse River. This is the position of the American forces approximately as October 3rd. So they've advanced from here to here. This is their ultimate goal, which is Sedan. A French city and a very important railroad hub. If the Americans can take this railroad hub, it will cause a large section of the German front to have to retreat because they can no longer be supplied. These areas here, again, I don't know if I said Mount Foucault, which is here. This is Cunel, Romage, and Barencourt. Small little villages built on hilly areas, so kind of pivotal strategic points to take. To kind of describe the overall landscape is that the Argonne Forest is very hilly, very dense. This I show is clear, but there's lots of little pockets of woods and trees and forested areas. It's just not dense forest. And hills and ridges, they go all through this area up to about this point up at Barencourt, where this opens up to kind of rolling ground or open ground. These red lines here represent the main German defenses, the first line of defense and then their reserve line. The goal of the second phase of the Americans is to push through the last of this rough terrain, get out to open ground where they can make steady progress. I have just some references of some. This is sort of a idea of a cutaway of the topography. That there would be these small hills with patches of woods, and these black lines here would indicate where the Germans would put fortifications, bunkers, and firing positions. And the reason for this would go is that the Americans would have to fight uphill, dealing with these, taking out these defensive positions. When they get to the top of the hill, the Germans could fall back, and they'd have to go down into a valley and repeat the process. And that's what this whole area was just ridge line after ridge line after ridge line. This is kind of an idea of a top-down view of what the battlefield would look like. Again, these are just to kind of give you references that you can look at as I'm talking. Is that the German defenses would be, at this point of the war, to look somewhat like this. You would have kind of woods and open area. Each one of these little dots would represent little fortifications, small little concrete emplacements or dugouts with wood and dirt, manned with a machine gun, maybe a small little trench going off to one side or the other for riflemen to provide support. There would also be men in the trees, up in like almost like a tree house kind of construction, where snipers would be. And you see the staggered formation that they would support one another. When these early areas would get overwhelmed by an attack, the Germans would fall back to the main trench line, which was supported by very sturdy concrete structures, almost little fortresses. And this would represent kind of a ridge line. Is usually where they put them, is on the crest of a hill looking down. So they'd have to go up the hill, take the top of the hill, but then the Germans could retreat back to other bunkers that were fortified back behind where they could hide from artillery fire. So unlike the image you might have of the First World War, which I know I've discussed this in previous videos, but I'm almost saying this for myself more than anything else, just to, as I said, it's been several months since I've recorded, is that the goal of the Germans would not be to stop the Americans at any given point. It would be a stiffening resistance that would get more difficult and more difficult and more difficult until eventually, if it broke, the Germans had something else they could retreat back to, reorganize, and go to a second line of defense and repeat the process. So with that said, let's let's get into it. So October 3rd is the last day of relative rest. I mean, rest is a kind of, that's, I mean, how you want to make it. It's a relative term in that the Americans weren't actively trying to push forward. But even in the periods of rest, there wasn't really fighting going on. Or sorry, there was still fighting going on, even during the periods of rest. On October 4th, the American Expeditionary Force resumed its advance as the second phase of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive began. This assault was not paired with the same kind of massive artillery bombardment that began Phase 1. It had been hard to get the artillery through the rough terrain where it could be useful, and the supply problems, though still bad, when were getting better, were still bad. So supply problems, though getting better, were still bad. Also at this point in the battle, the American tanks were few and far between. Tanks that had not already been destroyed at this point had either broken down, required maintenance, or could not navigate the hilly terrain or dense forests. So the Americans had lost much of their main support that they had had. In September, when the Americans had begun their attack, they had attacked lightly defended positions. Now they were assaulting the dreaded Hindenburg Line, the Germans' main defense in depth, which I discussed briefly here, and there's a more detailed video that I cover, the defense in depth video, which ran along the Argonne through the heights of Romanche Canal and past the Meuse. There was no going around the Germans. The only avenue was to smash through these defenses, and day by day the doughboys tried, only to be repeatedly driven back and counterattacked. Which, as I said earlier, with this seesawing motion, is that this system was designed for the Germans to be able to move. So even if the Americans took the first set or the second line of defenses, Germans in the third line could counterattack. So again, this is not a static battle by any means. Over and over again, American companies, typically made up of 250 to 150 men, would attack in the morning, only to have 30 or 20 or 30 men who had not been killed or wounded by nightfall. Casualties like this were commonplace at this point in the battle. I read more than a few accounts by doughboys that described when they were attacking the German lines, they would have to watch their footing to find places where they did not trip over fallen comrades. Others described hillsides literally carpeted with bodies of Germans and American soldiers as the battle seesawed back and forth on the same location, with bare ground difficult to see. By October, the Germans were not the only thing that the doughboys had to fear. The 1918 influenza epidemic was sweeping through the front lines, and in the close quarters, poor diet, and damp weather, the soldiers were falling ill in droves. The effect of the fall damp might seem minor to us today, but it had a terrible psychological effect. Not only was it cold and wet and uncomfortable, but the region was quite foggy, particularly in the valleys. Heavy mists would limit visibility, at times only to a few yards in the morning, particularly in the mornings. Firefights would break out in this foggy landscape where soldiers on each side exchanged fire with opponents they could not see. Excuse me. It also made gas attacks even more terrifying. It was harder to see the gas approaching when the soldiers would put on their masks. It would make it harder to see the gas approaching, and when soldiers would put on their masks, the moisture in the air would fog up their lenses and effectively blind the wearer. Accounts describe more than a few doughboys removed their masks to wipe the lenses clean, carefully holding their breath and shutting their eyes until they could replace the mask. But this was a terrible mistake, as doing so simply trapped the gas-infused air next to their face when they put the mask back on, rendering it useless. I believe it is impossible for anyone who did not live through this battle to understand the nightmare that the Meuse-Argonne Offensive was at this point. I've read things that have really stuck with me in the descriptions of the battlefield. One of these descriptions, or several of these descriptions, describe the valley strewn with bones that would have been down in these low points here, where the French had tried to push through the German defenses of the Meuse-Argonne years before, and in these valleys, French soldiers fell by the hundreds due to machine gun fire and artillery, and by the fall of 1918, animals and the elements had scattered these bones across the valley, a sight that I had no doubt left the doughboys with a sense of hopelessness when they were ordered to charge across these places of the dead. This phase of the battle contained some of the most brutal fighting in U.S. history across any conflict. It also holds some of the most well-known events in America's First World War experience. One of these stories is the Lost Battalion. On October 2nd, technically, when the American Expeditionary Force was at rest, several American infantry companies in the Argonne Forest moved forward to secure the flank of their division. So the Argonne Forest is here. The exact location was actually recently discovered only a few years ago. It had been lost or relocated, but roughly in this area of the Argonne Forest is where these companies had moved forward. The Lost Battalion was not a single battalion, but parts of several battalions, but it amounted to 554 men, about the size of a single American combat battalion in the field, so hence the name. The next morning, on October 3rd, still while the American Expeditionary Force was at rest, it became clear that the men who would become known as the Lost Battalion had become surrounded after Germans counterattacked. Using homing pigeons, a process where a note was attached to a pigeon trained to return to their roost at the headquarters, the Lost Battalion was able to make contact with the rest of the American Expeditionary Force and inform them of their plight. Had this been a French, British, or German battalion, the headquarters would likely have written them off as a loss. Hence they were referred to as the Lost Battalion, because no one expected them to come back. But the head of the American Expeditionary Force, General Pershing, personally ordered the Lost Battalion be rescued. This was not because Americans were more brave or loyal than their French, British, or German counterparts. It is just that these armies had suffered such high losses that the loss of another battalion would shock no one, either in the army or at home. But the war was still very new for the Americans, and the impact on morale, both on the home front and the front line, was a major concern. Thus, a series of attacks were launched prior to the main offensive in the Argonne Forest to reclaim the Lost Battalion. After the German counterattack initially surrounded the Lost Battalion, the Germans were in the process of retreating back to another defensive line, but they postponed this action because the opportunity to capture the Lost Battalion was too good to pass up. For the next 5 days, well into the beginning of the second phase of the offensive, the Lost Battalion endured attack after attack from all sides as they were surrounded. The doughboys ran out of food, water, and ammunition, and were forced to scavenge these items off the dead. They rejected all formal requests for surrender, and though many were captured during the course of the fighting, no official surrender was ever given. thirst was so bad that it was described that men drank out of a nearby creek that was described as running red with blood due to the number of bodies that had fallen into it. By October 8th, the Germans were forced to pull back and the Lost Battalion was rescued, but the cost was enormous. Of the 554 men, 194 walked back under their own power. To the American lines, another 144 had to be carried back in stretchers. 216 never made it back at all. My description of this event is rather short and in no way gives it justice. The story of the Lost Battalion has become the stuff of legends. Of those 554 soldiers, 7 were awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the highest award that can be given in the U.S. military. Such events almost begin to be viewed as fictional tales as they seem unbelievable. Movies have been made about the Lost Battalion, and this only seems to add to the sense that this was a story and not a real thing. But if you look past the popular myth of the event, it becomes apparent that these were not characters in a story, but very real people whose acts, though heroic, were real and had real consequences. One example is one of the Medal of Honor winners, Major Charles Whittlesey, the commander who is credited with holding the Lost Battalion together during the battle. He became a national celebrity after the war and even starred in a movie playing himself about the Lost Battalion and how it was recovered. But once the war was over, Charles Whittlesey struggles with the label of hero which he had been given. He often wondered and mentioned others if the epic struggle had been worth it, what it had been for. Had he surrendered when the Germans offered, many of his men would still be alive. The war would have been over in 6 weeks, and they all would have gone home. Was the resistance of the Lost Battalion worth the cost? Sadly, haunted by his war experiences, 3 years after the war ended, Major Charles Whittlesey took his own life. Facts like this are important to remember as they remind us that the doughboys, men like Major Charles Whittlesey, were real people who carried the burdens of war both in battle and in peace. I don't think that acknowledging these difficulties of these burdens diminishes their memory at all. In fact, I believe that remembering this shows the heroics that they did have in overcoming these very human emotions of fear and doubt. And by acknowledging their humanity, I think we respect them as real people and not simply stories in a book. Another relatively well-known story, perhaps the most well-known story of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, is that of Sgt Alvin York, another doughboy fighting in the Argonne at this phase of the battle. Again, he was actually not far from where the Lost Battalion conflict was happening. Many of you may know this story. Originally a pacifist because of his Christian beliefs, York was convinced to take up weapons and to fight in the war as a combatant. On October 8th, 1918, the same day the Lost Battalion was being rescued, he led an attack with only 7 men that resulted in killing 25 Germans and taking another 132 as prisoners. York, too, became a national celebrity after the war, and his story remains well known today, York being perhaps the best-known doughboy of the First World War. But a lesser-known part of the story, the part that I believe shows how war can affect a person, is that after this assault and after he returned with his prisoners, Sergeant York requested permission from his commanding officer to go back to the battlefield to look for wounded. His commanding officer told him that there were only dead left there, but York insisted. York would later say that he had taken so much life that day that he wanted to save one. Be it German or American, it did not matter. Given York's accomplishments, the commanding officer relented, but York's officer was right, and though he searched, he found no one alive. By sharing these stories, I don't want to give the impression that all the doughboys were reluctant fighters. Indeed, some relished in the fighting and wrote about it after the war as a great adventure. My point is simply that history is not just numbers, dates, names, and places, but a collective experience of real people that creates a mosaic. As we return to the overview of the larger events, I hope these accounts will help give some context of what the experience was for the individual doughboys and what their experiences were in the larger context of the battle. And with that, we'll resume the larger events. That for days the battle slogged on, with almost no progress being made. The Americans advanced quickly up to the first line of defense, and there the line stayed. On October 12th, a major event occurred, not on the battlefield, but in the headquarters of the American Expeditionary Force. The leader of the battle, General Pershing, stepped down as the commander of the offensive. Prior to this day, General Pershing was not only trying to run the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, but also run the entire American Expeditionary Force. Every American soldier in France was under his command, from the men in French ports unloading supplies, to the trainees and bases across France, to the doughboys fighting on the front lines, and everything in between. Pershing realized that he could not do it all, and by some accounts was on the verge of a mental breakdown. Today, there is a lot of criticism leveled at Pershing about how he ran this battle, some of it justified, as he certainly made his mistakes. But say what you will about him, it was a remarkable thing that he did here. This was not a cop-out, or him trying to leave someone else holding the bag. Had the Meuse-Argonne Offensive failed at this point, Pershing certainly would have received the lion's share of the blame. He was willing, but his willingness to put the mission and the men under his command before his own ego, which was by all accounts considerable, was a remarkable example of genuine leadership. Pershing relinquished command of the battlefield to subordinates that allowed him to better focus on the big picture problems the American Expeditionary Force was facing, and allowed the individual commanders to solely focus on the details of the battle. The two commanders put in place were General Hunter Liggett and General Robert Bullard, each who would deserve videos on their own, but this project has gotten large enough as it is, and much larger than I thought it would ever be, so I'm forced to draw the line somewhere. This reorganization led to a much more efficiently run American army, and over the remainder of the war we would see it evolve into we would see the evolution of the American army into a much increasingly effective on the battlefield. For close to 2 weeks, hard fighting there have been hard fighting that, as I've described, little to no gains, and suddenly the German lines collapsed. It was not the result of a major assault or some clever maneuver. What happened was, around October 16th, scattered groups of doughboys broke through the German lines around Meuse and Canal. Both sides were exhausted at this point, and when reports started coming into the German commanders that Americans were behind them, they believed that their positions were untenable and started to fall back. This allowed more doughboys to move forward, and sort of like peeling an orange, once a small tear has been made, the whole peel could be easily pulled away. Something to keep in mind here, though, is that the German army was exhausted at this point, and there's even the after-action reports in the American intelligence files after the war speculated that had this been the German army of 1915 or 1916, it probably wouldn't have resulted in this kind of panic and pullback. But at this point, many of the German recruits were poorly trained, exhausted, and hoping the war would end sooner than later. So because of that, the doughboys were fortunate that they were facing a less reliable foe than the French and British had faced for many years. But by nightfall of October 17th, Meuse and Canal were in American hands. And the Germans were falling back to their last defensive lines through Barencourt. So Meuse and Canal were taken, and the Germans fell back and the German forces fell back towards Baroncourt. And like that, the advance of the second phase was over. Hard fighting from October 14th to the 16th, with little gains being made. But then the German lines breaking on the 17th, and by the 18th, the Germans were in full retreat. But the Americans were exhausted and had no means to continue the attack. The doughboys were literally at the end of what was humanly possible, and a rest was called for. On October 18th, from October 18th to October 31st, the American Expeditionary Force rested and reorganized for preparation of Phase 3. So you can see that approximately this is where the Americans ended their advance and rested till October 31st, from the 18th to the 31st. Again, to kind of give, I don't think I said this at the beginning, you probably hopefully know this from the earlier videos. The distance from the main line up to Sedan was only about, I believe, about 20 miles. And that there was fighting. This was a very short advance. I mean, you think about how far a person could walk in a day. This is only a few miles in places that was moved forward, and there was heavy fighting there for near to 2 weeks. We'll cover the last phase will be Phase 3, which we'll discuss the end of the battle and also the end of the war. I thank you for your time, and I hope this was interesting, and see you in the next video.